without further ado, today's topic of presentation is a brief history of carbon sequestration in the United States. What does the future hold? Presented by Brian Guzman. Brian is the Director, Global Business Development and Technology with Premier Corex. And to give you a little bit of background on Brian, Brian began his career as a geologist for Ingrain in 2008, where he was an integral part of the company's validation period that led to the commercial launch of their product lines and subsequent sale to Halliburton. He is a technical expert in digital rock analysis and development of state-of-the-art technologies within the core analysis space. Recently, he has driven Premier's growth into the carbon capture and sequestration market through participation in Department of Energy-funded projects, development of training courses that help subsurface teams satisfy federal and state regulations, and consulting with commercial entities on existing projects. Over his career, he has held positions in operations, research and development, and sales and marketing. Brian has a bachelor's in geology from University of Texas at San Antonio, and in 2008, he received his master's in analytics from Texas A&M University in 2018. So with that, welcome, Brian. A quick reminder before I hand over the floor to Brian, please place your questions, comments, etc. in the chat feature. And after Brian's presentation, we should have about 10 to 15 minutes of interactive Q&A to address those questions. So I do highly recommend during Brian's presentation to put those comments and questions in the chat. And that way we can have a pretty lively discussion at the end. Thank you and welcome, Brian. I'll stop sharing and hand you the floor.
Perfect. Thanks, Dante. I appreciate the introduction. So I'll get this party started. Assuming you can see my screen just fine.
Yes, you should be good to go.
Perfect. Perfect. Okay, so thank you all very much for your time, and I look forward to kind of walking you through this brief history. It's been an interesting past few years as you know, Premier Corex, which kind of works in the core and fluids analysis space, has been kind of navigating all these changes occurring. And so I thought, you know, for myself, for my own education, I put some time into trying to understand chronologically kind of how this story began, and it kind of led to this presentation, which I think is pretty helpful. So kind of getting started, right? Where it all began. So that story starts with enhanced oil recovery, and then the initial steps that took place at a government level for carbon capture sequestration projects, which led to the Department of Energy regional partnerships and a lot of policy development. So I'll be talking about kind of all those things chronologically. Then the evolution of those regional partnerships into the regional initiatives, which were kind of consolidated and which kind of manage what are called the carbon safe initiatives. From that point on, I'll kind of go into the more recent kind of things that have been occurring over the past few years, which has been a lot, and kind of delve into the future on what looks to be occurring over the next 5+ years, and then a summary. So I won't belabor this part. I think Dante already talked about my background, but there is a legend along the bottom, if you see there, kind of starting pre-1980, going to the future. And you'll see this legend kind of throughout the talk. And so you'll see the coloring schemes: enhanced oil recovery, green, regulation red, partnerships purple, blue entities, government entities, and yellow sequestration, but not enhanced oil recovery. And so this timeline kind of shows you as we go through time where these different initiatives are starting, just to give everybody a sense of kind of the culmination of all these accomplishments through time. So where it all began, right? Enhanced oil recovery. So the Permian Basin is kind of where all this started in the early 1970s through the 80s with CO2 transport and utilization for enhanced oil recovery. So the first commercial flood site was Scurry County in 1972, which is now what you call today Sac Rock. And that was kind of driven by Chevron and their natural gas plants and transporting the produced natural gas about 220 miles for the injection sites. And it was kind of combined with high oil prices in the late 70s and early 80s, which led to these construction of 3 major pipelines, which you can kind of see on the graphic here. And the history of enhanced oil recovery moving forward has been like very steady growth a lot of this time, and looks to be a lot more given a lot of the recent developments, which I'll talk towards in the further along into the presentation. And so, but everything starts with policy and regulation, it feels like, right? So I think the primary regulation that really got some of the applications going was the Safe Drinking Water Act of 1974, managed by the EPA and delegated by the Underground Injection Control Program, or UIC. And kind of the foundation for even that was the guidelines for the Clean Air Act, which was enacted in 1963, but has gone through multiple amendments over time. And more recently, tax credits based on the 45Q documentation enacted by the Energy Improvement and Extension Act of 2008 has provided additional funding for enhanced oil recovery. So initially, those rates from the 45Q were about $10 per metric ton of carbon dioxide stored and used for tertiary injection, but the rate was adjusted annually in 2019 to $11.70. And then the Bipartisan Act in 2018 adjusted that rate even further to $35 per metric ton of carbon dioxide with a kind of a timeline of 2026. And then during COVID, the Inflation Reduction Act modified that rate even further to $60 per metric ton for carbon dioxide used for enhanced oil recovery purposes, and extended the timeline to qualify for this tax credit to 2033. So you'll kind of see this is the theme, as I'm just talking about enhanced oil recovery right now, but the primary focus of this talk for carbon sequestration, this has been occurring pretty rapidly the past 3 years. The focus on carbon sequestration, utilization, these sorts of topics, and the government's involvement in funding and subsidizing a lot of these efforts. So we started off in the 70s, and now we're in the late 80s. And so 1989, the Carbon Capture and Sequestration Technologies program was started or initiated at MIT. And it researched various technologies for capture, utilization, and storage of CO2 from stationary sources. So these would be like your ethanol plants as large emitters, very popular to use the CO2 produced from those plants and pipe it somewhere to be stored. And that's really kind of one of the main things occurring now. And it was an international consortium, and was recognized for its multifaceted approach for reviewing carbon capture storage from technical, economic, and political perspectives. And you know that initiative lasted for quite a while and was only recently shut down in 2016. And so you can kind of see a map there of you can still go to their website and kind of see some of the learnings that are shared there. Although there's so much that's been changing in the past 3 years, you know, it's more of a historical review for yourself than anything else, with some of the technological advancements that have occurred through other government initiated projects, which I'll be talking about. So if you look at that group, the CSI, which was Carbon Sequestration Initiative, was a subset of the MIT consortium, which was started in 2000 and was formed by MIT with about 19 members is what it peaked at. And so you can kind of see when these members joined. So there was a really big push in the early 2000s and some funding for some of these initiatives to look at this at a global scale. And if you notice, just looking here very briefly, you can see companies like Saudi Aramco looking at this, Shell, Schlumberger, Marathon, ConocoPhillips, you know, if you're working oil and gas, Suncor, but also utility companies like Duke, as an example, technology companies like Siemens, Ford, American Electric Power, just a kind of a mixed bag of different emitters, subsurface technology companies, energy companies that are understanding this market and how to kind of shape it and form it. But the government really got involved in 2003 more than anything when the Department of Energy funded and created a nationwide network of 7 regional partnerships called the Regional Carbon Sequestration Partnerships, or RCSPs. And the purpose of this group was to help determine and implement the technology, infrastructure, and regulations to promote carbon storage. And when this was initiated, it was really initiated in 3 phases, which was the characterization phase, the validation phase, and the development phase. And so this actual, the RCSPs kind of laid the groundwork for how we would be developing this technology further at both an academic and a commercial scale and a policy scale. And so they started by, in the characterization phase, collecting data throughout the United States from various CO2 sources and geologic formations. So kind of your emitters and your storage sites. They validated that by looking at storage with small scale field tests. So they actually drilled and injected a little more than 1 million metric tons of CO2 through these programs. And then the development phase was really trying to push that injection rate much higher, and has been going on ever since. So you can kind of see a summary of those different projects, 7 of them, which was composed of the Big Sky Carbon Sequestration Partnership, Midwest Geological Sequestration Consortium in the Illinois Basin, so on and so forth. And each of these projects, you can see that the different types, right? So they had saline storage where they're injected into a saline aquifer. Some of these were more on the utilization side with enhanced oil recovery, a mix of really those two. And you can see kind of how much CO2 was utilized or sequestered through each of these projects, but in total of over 12 million metric tons of CO2 was injected across these 7 projects, which was managed by the regional carbon sequestration partnerships. Another thing you'll notice through my talk is I'm listing my sources for each of this, where I pulled this information from. It's not really been presented chronologically from what I've seen, and I think it's good to keep those sources there. So if you need to look through that, please take a look in the video, and you can visit all these different links to see for yourself. And there's a lot more content than just what I'm showing here. So yeah, I'm just kind of repeating those accomplishments. Over 12 million metric tons of CO2, which demonstrated permanent, economic, and safe storage. The RCSPs also developed the National Carbon Storage Atlases and the Geographical Information System for storage of CCS data, which is still available today. And it also created a series of best practice manuals, which are very helpful, kind of summarizing the work that was done across those 7 projects and some of the learnings. So if you are looking to get into carbon capture sequestration projects or commercial side, this is a really good place to start, is to take the learnings from the RCSPs, which are publicly available. One of the big things was the creation and the successful permitting of a Class 6 a well in Region 5. And the great thing about this also is that the RCSP set the groundwork for commercial scale CCS projects through the Carbon Safe program, which was the Carbon Storage Assurance Facility Enterprise, which I'll talk about here further. But just kind of going through the best practice manuals, there are, I'm listing 5, there are a few more than 5, but the really main ones that I've kind of looked at and reviewed was the site screening, site selection, and site characterization for geologic projects, BPM, the public outreach and education for geologic storage, which is a big deal. You know, there's a significant effort of current funding and time has been spent on the social side of carbon capture sequestration projects and getting buy-in from the public. As we all know, this is something that has to be addressed, whether it be especially for things like pipelines or oil and gas related efforts. You know, the public can really, if they're not educated properly, they won't really understand the value locally to them and kind of what it's helping them do. And it's the same kind of challenges are going to be have to be overcome for carbon capture or carbon sequestration projects as well. So there's a lot of work that was done for the RCSBs and current funding and work being done today to address those societal social issues. Risk management and simulation for geologic storage projects, monitoring, verification, accounting, or MVA for short, for these projects, and the operation of carbon sequestration projects. Also, as I mentioned earlier, the Carbon Storage Atlas was developed through the RCSP, and the latest version was version 5 in 2015. But what this atlas has done is it's provided information to many stakeholders about what carbon capture utilization and storage is and how it works. Provide information to decision makers about CO2 storage resources in their states, so what's germane to them, and established some methodologies for estimating the storage resources in the US. But it also took information all over the US from public, private, the USGS, and integrated these into a couple of databases. One's the National Carbon Sequestration Database and Geologic or GIS called NatCarb, and the other is the Energy Data Exchange. And so both of these sites are still up and running, and you can actually see a lot of the information. It's a really good starting point. And really the RCSPs also kind of established a little bit more of those best practices when it came to data. One of the biggest challenges I've seen more recently for carbon sequestration projects is site location, which kind of has to address a few things. One of those is that it has to be fairly close to some kind of pipeline for, because corrosion resistant piping and transport of CO2 is quite expensive. So you want to find a location that's near to a pipeline. You also want to find a location that's near an emitter, so you don't have to transport this very far. And so these emitters, these factories, ethanol plants, what have you, they're spread throughout the US. And so that means that the search for the final point, which is the geologic location, is kind of spread out everywhere. It's not really localized in one area. I think we got a few hubs that are kind of developing now, especially as an example along the Gulf Coast. If you've seen the more recent acquisition by ExxonMobil through via Denbury, right? That's an example of some of the pipeline infrastructure through Louisiana, Texas, and a lot of the storage sites kind of coalescing in that area. But there's actually quite a few others all throughout the US. And if you don't have a good storage site, you don't have a pipeline nearby and an emitter, all of those three things have to mix together to make a pretty attractive prospect for carbon sequestration. So let's talk a little bit about policy development. And so kind of taking a step back, looking at our timeline here, back to 2005, the Energy Policy Act, which directed the DOE to carry out 10-year carbon capture programs in coal combustion facilities, and later amended to promote a robust carbon sequestration program. So from 2005, and then the Energy Independence Act and Independence and Security Act expanded the DOE's work from a research and development perspective. The Energy Act, the Infrastructure Investment Jobs Act more recently, and the Inflation Reduction Act. Each of these put funding and policies in place to help usher in the development of these academic, commercial scale solutions for carbon sequestration utilization. But simultaneously, on the policy side for subsidies, the tax credits were also being formulated. So in 2008, the Energy Improvement and Extension Act authorized federal tax credits for carbon sequestration by adding the 45Q to the federal tax code. In 2009, the 45Q tax credits were amended, and they were amended in 18 Bipartisan Budget Act, 2021, the Consolidated Appropriations Act, and also in 2022, the Inflation Reduction Act. So each of these amendments made it a little easier and provided more funding for the three main applications for carbon sequestration, which would be enhanced oil recovery, permanent sequestration, or carbon sequestration. or direct air capture. So kind of, I pulled one of the Section 45Q tax credit information documents from June 2008, or sorry, June 2021, June 8th. But you can see those that's already been changed more recently. So the general concepts differentiated between carbon dioxide and carbon oxide was adjusted in 2018. The credit amount changes were increased and have been year to year, and the financial penalty for any leaked carbon oxide or carbon recapture was expanded upon, and it's a topic I'll address a little bit more later. But more recently, in 2022, the Inflation Reduction Act has currently put those rates at $85 per ton for permanently stored, $60 per ton for enhanced oil recovery purposes, and then kind of breaks apart direct air capture into two groups: $108 per ton of CO2 stored when it is captured through a DAC technology and then stored permanently, versus $130 to $130 per ton of carbon dioxide captured by direct air capture, but for utilization, right? So the government's really playing a big role into ushering in this industry. And you can't really talk about carbon sequestration and carbon storage without talking about Class 6 permitting, which is a big topic today for a variety of reasons. So Class 6 wells were established in 2008 by the EPA and wasn't, or at least proposed, and it wasn't officially established until 2010 and then effective in 2011. And so since 2011, there has been a bunch of guidance documents published to assist the underground injection control, or USC directors that manage these Class 6 permits, to help them navigate, understand how to get approval and what rules they need to follow, what do they need to address when they're submitting that permit. And so the EPA is responsible for kind of managing these Class 6 permits at a federal level, except for in two states which have applied for and were granted primacy over Class 6 wells, and that would be North Dakota and Wyoming, 2018 and 2020 respectively. So we talked about some of the initial funding, some of the initial policies, the regional carbon sequestration partnerships that were started in 2003, and 45Q tax credits, which helped make this all possible, along with the permitting process for Class 6 when you actually want to put an injector well somewhere. So then later in 2019, supported by the Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management, the Regional Initiative for Accelerated Carbon Capture, Utilization, and Storage are continuing to identify and address knowledge gaps through these RCSPs, and the consolidation of the 7 regions initially were created into 4 regions. So this is the Department of Energy regional initiatives. The objectives were to address key technical challenges, kind of further expand upon what the RCSPs have already done, facilitate data collection, sharing, and analysis, evaluating regional infrastructure, and technology transfer. So right now, those 4 groups are managed by 4 entities. Kind of the west side is managed by New Mexico Tech. The kind of north, Dakota, Wyoming, and some of Montana, those areas is managed by the EERC, the northeast by Battelle, and the southeast by the Southern States Energy Board. And they kind of manage these those regions and the carbon safe initiatives that are occurring in each of those regions. So the carbon safe initiative began in 2016 to address technology gaps, critical path forward for carbon capture in each region, and is broken up into 4 phases. So phase 1 is pre-feasibility projects. And so the Department of Energy provides funding, which usually is a combination of the regional management group, so if it's the west side, that would be New Mexico Tech, some operator who's willing to put forth some cost for drilling a well, and a university in the area. And sometimes a national laboratory will participate to a small extent with some of the more researchy side of these initiatives. And so that's the collaborative nature of this deployed capital. And so, you want to have a strong host site, which is really a combination of the operator working very closely with the regional manager, which would be the ERC, New Mexico Tech, Battelle, or Southern States Energy Board, depending on the region that it's in. And looking at kind of addressing those three main points, right? The formation, the pre-feasibility is going to be heavily dependent upon data. So the formation, the pipeline, and the emitter, right? And so you have to put these three things together in a cost-effective manner to lead to a successful site. And one part about the data that's really interesting, and this is something I've seen occurring, is that there are different places you can look for the storage. And so the two main places that I've heard talked about more recently would be depleted fields and saline aquifers. And each has their own unique challenges, right? Like, so if you go into a depleted field, you're going to have a lot of data available to you because these are historically drilled oil and gas wells. They've been logged. There's been maybe seismic data collected in the past. And this data is a lot more numerous in a depleted field than it would ever be in some kind of a virgin saline aquifer where nobody's really drilled much of anything. And so there's a challenge from a data standpoint when you're not in a depleted field because you just don't have enough data, and data is quite expensive, as we all know, to collect. However, there's a kind of an inverse on challenges. If you are in a depleted field and you have a lot of data available to you, which is great, you're also going to have a lot of problems when it comes to plugged and abandoned wells and having to investigate each of these wells that are going to interact with the CO2 plume that you would be planning to inject in the area, right? So you have to investigate each of these wells per the guidance documents published by the EPA. And that's also quite an expensive endeavor. So you got like data on one hand, but you got all this risk that you have to manage. Whereas in a saline aquifer, you have no data. So there's a upfront cost there to try to understand that. And then, but much less of an inherent risk when it comes to P&A wells nearby that could create leakage points. And that would initiate recapture events from a 45Q tax credit, right? The government pays you these tax credits. And then if they find that in the future it's leaking, you got to pay them back. And that's what a recapture event is. So phase one really focuses on the pre-feasibility and site location and some very basic characterization. Phase two is when you actually put some projects into action and you actually go and you collect data. You do geologic and subsurface analysis. You look at local regulatory requirements or challenges that you're going to face at, maybe even the land level or pipeline level. And you're going to run subsurface models to assess and characterize the potential injection location, but also look at and monitor behavior of the CO2 storage plume. Of course, you're going to have to spend some time with public outreach. We kind of talked about that before. You have to have public buy-in for these efforts, otherwise you're just going to be shut down most likely. And so there's got to be a lot of education that occurs to the public. And in a phase two project, you have to drill at least one characterization well and acquire geologic data, core logs, core, and run a variety of well tests. Then you have phase three, which is kind of further expanding upon site characterization and permitting. So you've got to identify storage sites, so multiple in the storage complex. You actually have to prepare for a submission of a Class 6 permit for each proposed injection well. And you have to identify anthropogenic CO2 and necessary capture technologies as part of phase three, as part of your emitter or source. And you have to work with regulators to satisfy their requirements. And some things that are being commonly addressed in phase three address pore and surface rights with landowners and right of way when it comes to pipelines, things like that. So basically taking phase two, phase three is just another step further. And you can kind of see, I've been showing you these graphics as I've gone through explaining each of these phases. the nature of how spread apart these initiatives are throughout the U.S. And as Dante mentioned, my background is geology, and this has been a kind of a big change for the geologists of today, where I think in the past 15 years, basically, there's been a heavy emphasis on shale and kind of a less emphasis on conventional reservoirs. We're still doing a lot of that work offshore. There's still shallow wells being drilled consistently, but a large portion of the industry has been focusing a lot of its mind efforts, technologies on shale. And for these carbon sequestration projects, it's really brought it right back to conventionals for these injection sites. And so there's been a learning curve that's had to occur, not for geologists like myself, but for engineers and petrophysicists and anybody working subsurface. And if you have that skill from offshore, or you've been consistently in conventionals, you're going to find that there's a huge transfer of your knowledge for this kind of an application. And so it's exciting, because a lot of the study of these geologic formations is really quite spread out. And that's where kind of my story starts with Carbon Safe. I got started with the Carbon Safe 2 project a little over 3 years ago, which was the Patterson site in Kansas. And the KGS was kind of assigned and provided funds by the Department of Energy to assess storage locations in Kansas. And so this effort built upon all the different efforts that we have already discussed with something pertinent to the Kansas area, local emitter, and was led by Battelle in conjunction with the KGS. And so this is called the Integrated Mid-Continent Stacked Carbon Storage Hub. This information you can find is readily available. So you can see the logs, you can see the core data, all this stuff is public knowledge and is released. So it was funded by FOA 1450, and it was in partnership with Borexco. So there's the API if you're curious. Drilled in March through April 2022, so right during the initiation of COVID, which provided a whole bunch of other challenges from a drilling standpoint, if you can imagine. Some of y'all don't have to imagine, as you were probably drilling your own wells during that time. So, but it was quite a project with over 700 feet of core, taking a lot of site characterization, a lot of integration, and modeling of the CO2 plume, and some injection as well from an emitter, just to get started. And I think that at some point in the future, the phase 3 hopefully will begin in a year or two, with a lot of the new fundings and FOAs being published. So from my perspective, I didn't talk about it much, but I work in a Premier Corex is a rock and fluids laboratory. So we were responsible for the entire core analysis program on that project. And that really got us started on a lot more of those projects. So let's talk a little bit about what the future holds from a permitting perspective. So as you heard me mention earlier, permits were, primacy was granted to North Dakota and Wyoming. And this is a big deal because currently the EPA Class 6 wells, they're taking over a year to get permitted. That process is very arduous, and it is a commercial challenge. And so if you're in a state with primacy, it's actually a lot less painful and much quicker, 3 to 6 months. So this is something we want to push for, and many other states are wanting to push for. So, more recently, Louisiana is nearing, applied for primacy and is nearing the approval for primacy. So they can also join both North Dakota and Wyoming in expediting these Class 6 permits to usher in more commercial buy-in in their state. And I know, Arizona, Texas, and West Virginia are also pursuing this at the moment as well. So this map I have here on the right, you can kind of see really quickly, who's got primacy over what class of well. And so the only two in yellow, North Dakota and Wyoming, but hopefully we can make more yellow on this map to make these projects more feasible. And you really can't talk about the future without talking about funding. And the two biggest funds that really went through in the past few years was the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and the Inflation Reduction Act. And so in green, you can kind of see clean energy and climate investment funding in the billions of dollars. But a lot of those on the left, the infrastructure spending is a major part of a carbon sequestration project. And you'll see even within the past month, money being devoted towards infrastructure, because that's a big part of carbon sequestration is pipelines, retrofitting emitters with technology that can take CO2 produced at their facility, whether it be direct air capture, whether it be some other technology that would need to be developed depending on the emitters technology, what if they're an ethanol plant, if they're coal seam or whatever they are, to connect that to some existing pipeline and move that to some carbon sequestration location. So just on May 17th, as an example, from the awarded funding from the IRA, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, I'm sorry, the IIJA, 251 million was approved to expand the infrastructure in support of CO2 transport and storage. Of that, 242 million was to support the development of new and expanded large-scale commercial projects. So that's 9 projects in 6 states, and the remaining 9 was for kind of CO2 pipeline network investigation here in the Gulf Coast. So those were all Carbon Safe 3 programs. So you got the Blue Bonnet Sequestration Hub, BP's work that they're doing here in the Gulf Coast, Colorado School of Mines in conjunction with Carbon America, Magnolia Sequestration Hub, Southern States Energy Board, so on and so forth. Each of these teams was awarded a sizable amount of money to pursue in their area carbon sequestration sites. And kind of from the areas of interest that this bill was really looking at was Carbon Safe 3, Carbon Safe 3.5, Carbon Safe 4, which is kind of the last phase of a Carbon Safe, which is commercial construction and deployment of multiple injection sites, and additional Carbon Safe 2 funding. So this is a funding notice that was published on that same May 17th ticket, but the deadline was the end of July, I think July 20th. And this one was over $2.25 billion of funding available. And so you can see the number of awards that they're planning to provide for these areas of interest and the relative amount per each award, which is very, very sizable. And this is just to kind of go and to show that a lot of this effort, this is happening month to month. And like, if you are in this space of carbon sequestration, every month something's being published, something's being funded, something's being awarded, some deadline is coming up. And so there's a lot going on right now, and everybody's just trying to keep up. We're all drinking from a fire hose. One area that I've been looking at more recently is the carbon credit side of things, and how this how that works, right? So carbon credits are basically given to people who have a large carbon footprint. They have to earn these credits to offset that footprint. So if you're a huge emitter, you need to do something to kind of pay for that pollution or whatnot that you're creating. And so carbon credits are given to people who set up site sequestration locations or build direct air capture facilities to pull the equivalent of what they're putting into the atmosphere back out of the atmosphere. And these carbon credits are provided. In some cases, companies really focus on building their entire business on carbon credits, and then they sell those credits to people who have large carbon footprints and don't have the skills or the time or whatnot to offset it with their own internal initiatives. And so they are transferable. And this has kind of created this carbon market, if you will. However, these credits are subject to recapture, which I talked about earlier, which is recapture occurs when qualified carbon oxide that was previously claimed, that the IRS gave you credit for, ceases to be disposed. So if you injected it somewhere and then there was a leak, or you utilized it somewhere in an EOR project and found that it was leaking, the IRS would come back and recapture that credit from you. So right now, the current rules are that they can only be sold once, and who claims depreciation? The seller does, and tax credits, who keeps the proceeds? They're not actually subject to federal income tax. And kind of wrapping it up here, working at Premier Corex and getting in line with all the kind of the speed at which things are occurring, I focused a lot of my time and efforts on developing training content and workshops in the subsurface space for core and fluids analysis. And a lot of these different stations or subjects are explicitly stated in the guidance documents by the EPA. And so there's a lot of learning that needs to be done by subsurface experts to address these different concerns when you're trying to get through a Class 6 permit. So reservoir characterization, routine special core analysis, mechanical properties for the injections, the confining zone, which is like the cap rock, and the interaction of the injectate or the CO2 with the existing formation fluid, water, or rock, and then taking all this data and upscaling it to simulate the behavior of the plume and how is it going to move once it's injected. There's also a lot of consortiums being developed. One that we're hosting is called the CO2 Permanent Emplacement Consortium, or COPE, and we're looking to further establish industry best practices through the different phases of subsurface analysis, simulation, and actual injection and monitoring on injected wells and reconciling that data together. So in summary, since the early 1970s, you really can't tell the story of carbon capture without utilization, and that was all started with enhanced oil recovery. And the 45 tax credits, they provide funding for EOR, they provide funding for carbon sequestration and direct air capture. Carbon capture, sequestration R&D. So variety of partnerships between educational and commercial entities started as far back as 1988 and have continued to expand and develop. And the Department of Energy began really getting involved in 2003 with these partnerships through the regional carbon sequestrations partnerships and subsequent regional initiatives that are currently in place today. Obviously, subsidies are a big deal. So the 45 tax credits are a big, have a huge influence on ushering in the adoption and the commercial pursuit of these technologies. And those are currently managed by the 4 groups. So yeah, funding, big deal. You can see companies like Exxon acquiring Denbury. They're putting a lot of their money effort on this. Chevron, Shell, a lot of these large super majors all have sizable carbon sequestration teams. And I kind of think gives a sense of what the future is going to hold. So a lot of this funding has been extended through 2033. And taking that funding and getting a Class 6 well approved is slow now, but with primacy being pushed by a variety of states should speed up adoption. So with that, I thank you for listening on this journey with me. And I guess I'll open the floor for questions and then I'll leave that to Dante to coordinate, right?
Yeah. Thank you, Brian. Excellent presentation. A lot of ground covered for a brief history.
Very brief, right? There's a lot going on here.
There's been a lot, definitely. But let's jump right into the Q&A. The first question coming from Zeno Philip is, do the CO2 credits for EOR and sequestration have the same 45Q tax credits?
No, they're at different amounts. Well, I guess the funding is different. I'm not quite sure on the interplay, but this is something I'm still looking at right now. The interplay between the tax credit and the funding, right? So the enhanced oil recovery is $60 per metric ton of CO2 utilized, and sequestration is like $130 per metric ton, I believe it was. So there's differences in the amount that you get for those tax credits. How their relation to the actual, I guess the answer is yes. I'm still trying to understand if there's a little bit of differences there, but the answer is there's 3 levels, there's 4 levels, one for enhanced oil recovery or utilization, one for carbon sequestration, and I'm moving up in value here, and then 2 for direct air capture. One is for direct air capture where you're using the CO2 for utilization, and then the highest paid is when you're using it for storage. Direct air capture through storage.
Makes sense. The next question from Sharad Behal is, are RCSPs still injecting, specifically asking about in the saline aquifers?
I believe a few of them are. I don't think it's through the RCSPs anymore, as those 7 groups that I mentioned to you. They were feasibility studies, but I think there are a few that are still doing some kind of injection, or they've been rolled up into the regional initiatives for additional funding. I could speak to some that are in Florida that were initiated in like 2010, I believe it was. And that was DOE funded. Those projects I know of, because we're part of them, are still being, commercially improved upon and development. So I would say the answer is yes. I just don't know which ones off the top of my head.
Got it. And next question is from Oliver Miande. He's asking, has there been any records of leakage from CO2 from sequestration sites? And I would expand on that. You talked a little bit about potentially having to recapture some of those credits issued if there was some leakage. Is this a common scenario? Can you comment on that?
I haven't read about any of that yet. I think the recapture events are more recent. In the past 4 or 5 years, that language was added to 45Q, I think in 2018. And I haven't personally been involved in any of that, nor have I read about a recapture event. So I think there's still adoption and funding of technology to monitor, right? That's the whole monitor and verification and accounting aspect of a carbon sequestration project. And there's still funding and research being done into that monitoring side of things. So there hasn't been a ton of commercial injection to date yet. A lot of that is starting to pick up in the next 6 months to a year. And I think we'll probably start hearing a lot more about recapture events, because a lot of the legal around carbon credits, recapture events is still being amended, developed right now. And I think the application of that stuff is going to be happening in the next few years, and we'll probably see a lot more of that occurring. Got it.
Well, thank you for that answer, Brian. The next question I want to bring up is from Carl Montgomery. And I think Carl's bringing up a question that's on a lot of our minds is, do you have an idea of what the CO2 balance for the United States is today? How much is being generated versus how much is being captured?
I've read some of that before. I can't recall it off the top of my head, but I think the short answer is a lot more is being generated than we're capturing, and a lot more is being generated than we currently even have options for injection in the next 2 or 3 years. So there's a huge disparity between globally the goals of something like the Paris Climate Accord or the United States kind of more recent goals up through, I think, 2050. There's a huge disparity between those goals and what's actually achievable in the next 5 years, with all this money being kind of dumped into these different regional initiatives, research initiatives. So there's a huge disparity, and that's what's creating this massive injection of time, resources, and money, and why a lot of these energy companies like the Exxons and the Shells are spending so much of their time and effort building up these teams and investigating these different sites and grabbing a lot of this funding that's being pushed out there. I mean, I think I just read, was it a day or two ago, that Occidental was a part of that $1.2 billion direct air capture funding announcement in the Gulf Coast. So these things are occurring on a monthly basis, and it's happening so fast because that disparity is massive. I don't know the actual numbers right now, but I have read it before.
Absolutely. And talking about the amount of effort going into look at all these different potential candidate sites, I'm going to combine 2 questions from the audience. One is from Dale Edwards, and the other one's from Chris Batzer. In the phase 1, that preliminary stage, are there specific things that are looked at, such as competency of the storage site? And expanding on that, is there a lot of remediation work typical on offset aged wells to prevent inadvertent leak points? Are you looking at things such as neighboring well density, so number of wells per square mile? Can all of these things factor into candidate selection?
Can you say the first half?
The first half is in general, what kind of things are looked at for selecting these storage sites, right? So competency of the storage site, and then it also includes, if you're looking at historical depleted fields, do we also need to look at the specifics of the wells themselves, how degraded are the wells, how much workover might need to be done on the well, density of existing wells at that particular site, etc.?
Yeah, so to address the first point, I think one of the biggest things that I read about in the literature is that if you're going to apply for one of these site locations, it needs to be able to hold over 50 megatons of CO2 as a base threshold to be qualified as a large scale carbon sequestration project, which kind of unlocks that higher level of funding. So a lot of these carbon safe initiatives, that's a base threshold. And then kind of just repeating what I said earlier about kind of the three main points, right? The geologic storage site with an overlying confining zone to keep it trapped, the pipeline infrastructure nearby. So you need to be close to one because it's expensive to lay pipe like $1 million plus a mile for corrosion resistant piping. And you need to have some kind of an emitter that you are partnered with and that has developed or is developing the technology to capture the CO2 from their facility and then piping it to said pipeline that's going to take it to the sequestration site. So right now, those are like the thresholds are pretty big level questions. And, there's a lot of funding going out. So, I'm seeing if you have anywhere near any of those things kind of quantified and you have your partner between a university, an emitter, an operator, and you're probably going to get, it feels like you're getting funded. So it's really those main things that I can speak of right now. As far as depleted fields and the kind of work that needs to be done to kind of mitigate against leakage, everything you stated there, absolutely right. I mean, that's just kind of that is the issue, because you're going to be going into an area with a bunch of P&A wells or even wells that are on production, which is another issue altogether. And I didn't really address that, but that is an issue. Can you imagine if you were on producer and someone wants to inject CO2 near you and that CO2 inadvertently affects your production in a negative way? That's a whole other issue that is being discussed. But just looking at the P&A well side of things, the guidance documents published by the EPA do have best practices and recommendations associated with investigating each of these P&A wells and offer different technologies to do so. For example, looking at the cement job on these wells is a big deal. And currently, a lot of the service companies who develop and create cements are investigating certain cement mixes that are resistant to CO2. So if these are old wells with old cement jobs, they're not going to have this resistant cement. Currently, new cement is being developed for the actual injection wells themselves that is more resistant to CO2. So there's a lot talked about on the cement jobs for this purpose and this purpose alone, because anywhere your CO2 plume is modeled to intersect with a P&A well, that is a weak point. And there is documentation that talks about how you should address that. And the EPA will review that in your area, which I think has discouraged a lot of people from looking in these depleted fields, despite the fact that there is more data available. So I think what you're going to see in these depleted fields, maybe more, could be enhanced oil recovery applications with a smaller footprint, where the plume maybe isn't going to be intersecting with as many of these historical wells.
No, absolutely. When you consider everything that you just discussed, it can become quite an intractable problem at a certain point. But I want to address two more questions before we conclude the Q&A session. The first is related to a little bit more to the services you're conducting at Premier Corex, and that is, when you do core analysis for CO2 sequestration and evaluation, what are the main parameters that you're analyzing or measuring, and do you have specific value ranges that you look for?
I think right now, the major thing that's being investigated is the supercritical CO2 and its reaction with the reservoir. I would say that 90% of everything that I'm seeing right now come through the lab is in a sandstone with very high permeability, porosity, greater than 18-20% plus, well connected, not a high volume of clays. So I've seen a lot of those kinds of things come through. We do have about 10% of that is carbonate. and that poses other challenges, right? If it's carbonate and you're injecting CO2 in supercritical form and it's mixing with water in the subsurface, you can create carbonic acid, which would then etch and maybe create areas of weakness or wormholing that could have some problems. So that's why I think 90% of what we see is sandstone. And the challenge on the laboratory side is having corrosion resistant piping and fittings for a lot of the relative permeability and core flood instrumentation. That's one challenge. Also, the fact that now this new market, carbon sequestration, is competing with the oil and gas market for the same equipment. There's a lot of the turnaround time has been a challenge across these different laboratories, such as ourselves as well. So there's a challenge from a turnaround standpoint, an EPA permitting standpoint, equipment being retrofitted to deal with supercritical CO2, and relative permeability is being one of the major inputs. If you go through the guidance documentation for site characterization, which is available on the EPA's site, it kind of goes through those different sections that I showed earlier, just right here. Each of these sections, reservoir characterization, routine special core analysis, rock mechanics, they're all discussed in the guidance documents, and you have to have those answers when you're submitting a Class 6 permit, which is why these events that we've been hosting, these training events and workshops, have been basically sellout crowds every time, because so many people are just trying to grasp and get their heads around, what do I need to do to get this permit through this entire process?
By the sound of it, a lot.
A lot, yeah.
The last question I want to ask, because I do know Premier has access to a lot of information. I know you guys have some collaboration spaces where you compile multiple member core and geological data to present a more clear picture. So this is related to the question from John Dahl. And John is asking, what are the options for acquiring geomechanics data for zones that were missed during a coring run, or even zones that weren't logged? Is there any interplay between these additional collaboration spaces and potential work for CCS?
Absolutely. So yeah, that's a good point. So data can come in the form of raw logs, seismic, legacy seismic, or in this question, right? Premier has two longstanding consortiums, or what we call collaboration spaces, in the Permian Basin, and there are wells being looked at for carbon sequestration in the Permian Basin. We've looked at a few of those wells. We got some on the books coming up in the next 6 months in those areas in both New Mexico and Texas. And so taking information from these existing consortiums, data that Premier owns as an example, we can use that in the initial assessment or the area of review documentation for the EPA. And you can take some of the interpretations that have already been built upon through the data provided by these consortiums on an oil and gas application side, and apply that for carbon sequestration to understand the extent of your reservoir, how much could you fit, what's the total, what is the fracture gradient behavior going to be like if you're injecting, how much CO2 can you inject before you initiate a fracture? All these things, you need to understand the confining zone, and you mentioned specifically rock mechanics. So the standard workflows that you would use for oil and gas would be very applicable here. And so, like I said, if you had that data available to you, you can make use of it to kind of expedite that permitting process where you have existing data and activity. So these existing consortiums are a huge wealth of value if they are overlapped in an area that you are looking at for carbon sequestration projects.
Absolutely. Well, Brian, we are a few minutes over time, so I want to conclude the Q&A session. I want to thank you for walking us through this brief history in the US, and also providing some insight into what the future may hold, and really, illustrating how complex and how widely scoped the focus of these studies need to be in order to really meet the requirements for these classifications, right? So, and permitting, but a lot of opportunity out there, and especially for us in the oil and gas industries, it sounds like a very well-suited application for our skills and knowledge. So with that, thank you very much for your presentation, Brian. Before everyone leaves, I do want to remind you to please join us next week, where we host Sean Liu and Frank Zamora with Premier Corex, presenting shale organic matter interaction in non-aqueous drilling fluids. And last but not least, thank you to everyone in the audience for your ongoing participation for NSI Days. Thank you for joining us and giving up an hour or a little bit more every Wednesday to join these talks and to participate with our guest speakers. Thank you to everyone who placed your questions and comments in the chat and enhancing this Q&A session. And most importantly, thank you again, Brian and Premier, for sharing this excellent presentation. We will be posting the recording of this session later today, and I will also be sharing the transcript of the Q&A with you, Brian. So if there was any questions we missed during the Q&A, we'll have an opportunity to address those as comments to our LinkedIn post. Last but not least, if you are interested in sharing additional topics within NSI Day and being hosted as like a speaker, please let me know. Just shoot me an email at info@nsitech.com. We're always looking for new guest speakers, new case studies, and new topics to be hosted on this session. So please don't be shy. Let me know if you'd like to be a guest speaker, and we will coordinate accordingly. Well, thank you very much. That concludes week 176 of NSI Days, and I hope everyone has a great rest of your Wednesday, and we look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you again, and have a great day.